The prairie stretched wide and dry, its grass brittle under the late afternoon sun. Dust rose in faint spirals where the wind dragged across the open ground. Jonas Hale rode slowly, keeping his weight steady in the saddle, eyes scanning the horizon the way a man did when he was used to being alone in dangerous places. His horse, a dark bay gelding with a scar down its flank, shifted its ears back and forth at the faint sounds carried by the wind. Jonas had been riding a long circuit from his cabin to the grazing range and back, checking fence lines, looking for signs of rustlers, and making sure his few head of cattle hadn't wandered too far into the open flats. Jonas was a man who rarely spoke unless it mattered. His face carried lines that made him look older than his 39 years, and the scar across his jawbone was the kind that never faded no matter how many winters passed. He had spent younger years working as a hired gun, moving from camp to camp, job to job, until the weight of bloodshed pushed him towards solitude. The cabin he built on the edge of the prairie wasn't just a home. It was distance from people, from questions from the man he used to be. Every choice he made was to keep that distance. That day, he wasn't expecting to see anyone. He thought only of getting home before dark, of boiling beans, of sharpening his tools. But a shape appeared in the shimmer of heat ahead, stumbling, too unsteady to be a rider. He slowed his horse, watching. As the figure grew clearer, he saw it was a woman, her dress torn at the seams, one sleeve ripped away entirely, her arms mottled with bruises and dirt. Her hair, once tied neatly back, hung in loose strands across her face. She walked as though every step might drop her to the ground, her body shifting weakly, her knees buckling. Jonas's stomach tightened. In that part of the country, a lone woman staggering across open prairie wasn't lost by accident. He rode closer, his hand near the rifle slung under his leg, though he didn't draw it. The closer he got, the clearer he saw the cloth bundle she clutched against her chest, the fabric darkened with blood that had long since dried. When her eyes found him, there was no relief. Instead, her face broke with fear, and her voice cracked as if the words cut on the way out. "I'm not clean anymore." She shook her head as if trying to push him away, then faltered, her body collapsing in the dust. Jonas swung down from the saddle in one movement, his boots sinking into the dirt. He crouched beside her. She was younger than he'd first thought, mid-20s, maybe, her cheeks hollow, her lips cracked from thirst. Her hands clutched the blood-stained cloth so tightly her knuckles showed white. Jonas reached out slowly, testing her reaction. She jerked back, even in her weakness, pulling the bundle closer. For a moment, he considered leaving her where she was. He told himself she might bring danger, that trouble followed people like this, and he had worked too hard to cut trouble out of his life. But as he watched her chest heaving, her breath shallow, he knew she would not last another night out there. And something in him, the part that had lived through too many silences and regrets, wouldn't allow it. He slid his arms under her, lifting her carefully. She weighed next to nothing, and he felt the tremors in her body against his chest. He smelled the iron of blood, the dirt, the long days of struggle. She didn't resist now. Her head fell against his shoulder. Jonas placed her across the saddle, mounted behind her, and gathered the reins. The ride back to his cabin was slow, every step of the horse rocking her frail body. Jonas held her steady with one arm, scanning the horizon as he rode. His mind worked over what he had seen, the bruises, the fear, the bundle of cloth. He didn't know her name, didn't know what had been done, but he knew cruelty when he saw it. He had seen too much of it before, had carried it on his own hands once. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting the prairie in long shadows, Jonas reached the narrow valley where his cabin stood. Smoke from his last fire still clung to the roofline, a reminder of the quiet life he had built. He slowed his horse, shifted his grip on the woman, and spoke aloud for the first time since he had found her. "You'll make it," he said, his voice steady, as if saying it out loud could make it true. The horse carried them toward the small, weathered cabin, the only shelter for miles, where Jonas Hale had meant to live alone. But by nightfall, that silence would be broken by the presence of a woman who carried scars he had yet to see, and both their lives would be altered in ways neither could have expected. Jonas pushed the cabin door open with his shoulder, the woman limp in his arms, her weight lighter than he expected. The dim room smelled of wood smoke and dry earth, the fire in the stone hearth reduced to faint embers. He laid her gently on the bed, just a narrow frame with a wool blanket, and for a long moment he stood there, his chest rising and falling, unsure what to do next. Her bundle of blood-stained cloth was still pressed to her chest. Even in her half-conscious state, her fingers clutched it tightly, refusing to let it go. Jonas didn't try to take it from her. He knew the look of someone guarding the last thing they believed they owned, and he didn't want to start with a fight. Instead, he pulled the blanket up to her shoulders, then crossed the room to pour water into a tin cup from the bucket he kept near the door. He came back and crouched beside her. "Drink," he said, his voice low but steady. She stirred, eyes opening only a little. At first, she resisted, lips clamped tight, but then she parted them and let him press the rim to her mouth. She took a few small swallows, coughing at the first taste, then finished what he offered. Her hand shook, and her eyes darted toward the door as if expecting someone else to walk in behind him. Jonas noticed her fear and the way she pulled back from even the slightest touch. He didn't ask questions. Not yet. The last time he had pressed someone for their story, it had cost him a friend years ago in Texas, and he had learned the hard way that people tell what they're ready to tell. No sooner. As he set the cup aside, Jonas found his eyes on the cloth she guarded. The dark stains had soaked deep into the fibers, old enough to have dried, but fresh enough to carry a sharp odor. He wondered if it hit a wound, a child, or something worse. His hand moved instinctively, but before he reached for it, her voice rasped out, raw and broken. "Don't look." The words were almost a plea, almost a threat, and the desperation in her tone stopped him cold. Jonas leaned back, nodded once, and left the bundle untouched. "Fine," he said quietly. "Not tonight." He pulled a chair close to the bed and sat. The fire needed feeding, so he rose, dropped a few logs onto the coals, and watched the flames catch. The glow spread across the small cabin, lighting the rough shelves, the rifle propped by the door, the tools he kept for work on the land. Jonas knew she would notice those things when she fully woke. The signs of a man who lived alone, who had chosen to keep his life stripped down to what was needed. The hours passed slow. She drifted in and out of uneasy sleep, sometimes mumbling words he couldn't make out. Once she whispered a name. He thought it was Thomas, or maybe Tom, and her face twisted as if in pain. Jonas sat silent through it all, his hands folded, eyes fixed on the fire. At dawn, he stepped outside to fetch water from the creek. The prairie was quiet, the sun just a thin line along the ridge. He checked for tracks, a habit that came from years of mistrust. The ground around the cabin was clear. Still, he felt unsettled. A woman alone in that condition didn't simply appear by chance. Someone had done this, and someone might come looking. Back inside, he found her awake. Her eyes followed him, wary but sharper than the night before. She didn't speak. He set the water down and said, "You'll need food soon. I'll see what I can make." She swallowed hard, then finally whispered, "Why are you helping me?" Jonas paused at the table, his back half turned. He didn't have an easy answer, not one that fit in a single sentence. After a long silence, he said, "Because leaving you out there didn't sit right." It was the truth, stripped down, and he saw her shoulders ease only slightly at the words. As he lit the stove and set a pot to boil, Jonas thought of what the night had shown him. She was fragile but not weak. Whatever she had endured had stripped her bare of trust, but she still fought to hold on to something, whether it was dignity, memory, or simply survival. He didn't know her name, didn't know where she had come from, but already he felt the weight of responsibility settle on him. He wasn't sure he wanted it, but he also knew he couldn't step away from it. The woman closed her eyes again, clutching the cloth bundle close to her chest. Jonas stood over the stove, waiting for the water to boil, already aware that whatever lay inside that cloth would decide much about what happened next. The morning stretched slow inside the cabin. Smoke curled from the stove where Jonas stirred a pot of thin broth, the smell of boiled beans and salt filling the air. The woman lay back on the bed, her face pale, lips cracked, eyes darting between him and the door as though measuring whether she could leave if she had to. She had survived the night, but her body was weak, her hands still locked around that bundle of stained cloth. Jonas set a bowl on the table, letting the steam rise. He didn't press her to eat right away. He had learned patience the hard way, back when pushing a wounded man too soon meant losing him before his time. He watched her from the corner of his eye while pretending to focus on his meal. She shifted, tried to sit up, and winced. The motion pulled at something under the cloth she guarded. For the first time, Jonas caught a glimpse of her forearm. Slashes, not the kind from accident or wilderness, but deliberate marks carved into flesh. His jaw tightened. Whoever had done it had meant to break her, to leave reminders on her skin. He brought the bowl to her. Eat what you can. At first, she turned her face away, ashamed or stubborn. But the smell finally pulled her in. She took the spoon with trembling fingers, lifting it slow, swallowing with effort. Jonas noticed how she didn't look at him while she ate. Her gaze fixed on the wall, as if she didn't want him to see how hunger had hollowed her out. When the bowl was half empty, her voice came, faint but clearer than before. You want to know who I am? Jonas didn't answer right away. He leaned back in a chair, arms crossed. When you're ready. She blinked at him, startled by the lack of demand. After a pause, she said, Eliza Carter. She drew the cloth bundle tighter against her chest, waiting for his reaction, as if her name might carry some weight or shame. Jonas kept his face even, showing nothing. Jonas Hale, he said simply, offering his own in return. Eliza's eyes studied him now, his rough hands, the scar along his jaw, the rifle by the door. She saw the life of a man who had kept to himself, maybe for reasons he wouldn't share. For the first time, her shoulders eased just a fraction. Hours passed. She tried to rise again, but her legs gave out. Jonas caught her before she hit the floor, steadying her by the arms. Her face flushed with humiliation, her voice breaking. Don't touch it. Her eyes dropped to the cloth she carried. Jonas let her go, guiding her back to the bed, but keeping his hands light. Whatever's there, he said quietly, I'll need to see. If it's a wound, it won't heal under old rags. Her breathing quickened, panic rising. No, you can't. She clutched it tighter, her whole body shaking. Jonas backed off, his voice calm, measured. Then you tell me what you're carrying. For the first time, she loosened her grip. Her eyes filled, her throat working as she forced the words. They cut me. They marked me. They said I'd never be clean again. She pulled the cloth aside just enough for him to see. The jagged burns and slashes across her torso, carved symbols left behind by men who wanted to brand her as ruined. Jonas's stomach turned cold. He had seen violence, had made plenty himself, but this was something darker, meant not to kill, but to erase a person. He went pale, but said nothing sharp, no curse, no pity. Instead, he stepped away, poured water in a basin, and set out clean bandages. I'll help you fix what can be fixed, he said. His voice stayed even, though his jaw was tight. The rest, you decide what it means. Eliza's hands trembled as she let him replace the filthy cloth with clean linen. He worked carefully, eyes steady, not flinching at the scars. She watched him with suspicion at first, then confusion, and finally something like relief. No disgust, no judgment, only a man doing what needed to be done. By nightfall, her wounds were wrapped fresh. She lay back against the quilt, exhausted, whispering almost to herself, They'll come for me. Jonas sat at the table, the rifle within reach. He didn't look at her when he answered. Then they'll find me here first. The fire popped. The prairie winds pressed against the cabin walls, and in the heavy silence between them, something unspoken began to take root. A fragile trust, born not from words, but from the simple fact that, for once, someone stayed. The next days unfolded in slow, practical rhythms, and Jonas kept them steady on purpose. Eliza needed order, something reliable, and he knew it. He rose at dawn, stoked the fire, boiled water, and stepped outside to split wood or walk the line of the creek. She watched him at first with suspicion, as though expecting him to vanish or to demand something in return. When he came back, he always set food on the table before her, plain but filling, and said nothing if she only picked at it. Her strength began to return, though she still winced whenever she shifted onto the fresh bandages. Jonas noticed how she stayed alert, always turning her head toward the sound of hoofbeats on the wind or the creak of a branch outside. At night, she jolted awake at the crackle of the fire. He didn't ask who she feared, because he already knew. Men who carved scars into another person didn't let go easily. Jonas himself moved with the same silence he always had, but now there was a purpose to it. He checked his rifle each evening, wiping the barrel clean, counting the rounds. He knew she saw him do it. He wanted her to see. A man who expected peace didn't keep his gun that close. One morning, as he mended a broken strap on his saddle, Eliza finally spoke more than a handful of words. "You live here alone." Jonas gave a brief nod. By choice. She studied him, sitting wrapped in the quilt near the fire. Her voice was soft, but carried weight. Most men can't stand their own silence. Jonas didn't lift his eyes from the leather he worked. "I earned mine. Hard way." He didn't go further, but the scar on his jaw and the wear on his hand said enough. He had walked with violence, and then he had walked away from it. Eliza seemed to measure that answer. She pressed the quilt tighter to her body. "I used to live east of here. My father kept a store by the wagon road. After he died, there was no one left. I tried to make my way to town." That's when she cut herself off, jaw tightening. Her gaze dropped to the floor, unwilling to name what had been done. Jonas set down the strap and finally looked at her. "You don't need to say again." His voice was steady, without pity. That seemed to steady her more than if he had asked questions. The days went on. They worked side by side, without ceremony. She swept the floor while he patched the roof. She stirred the pot while he cut firewood. Once, when she dropped a plate and it shattered, she froze, bracing for anger. Jonas only swept the pieces aside and handed her another. Her face softened for the first time, almost in disbelief. That night, as the fire dimmed low, she broke the silence once more. "You never asked why I said I wasn't clean." Her eyes glistened in the glow. Jonas leaned back in the chair, the rifle leaning against his knee. "Didn't need to. I saw enough." Her throat worked as if she wanted to argue, but no words came. Instead, she pulled the quilt over her shoulders and turned her face to the wall. He could see the tremor in her hand, but he also saw that she didn't clutch the bundle of cloth anymore. For the first time since she had arrived, she allowed it to rest on the floor beside her. Later, when the cabin had gone still, Jonas sat at the table and thought of the tracks he had checked that morning near the creek. Shallow, blurred, but real. They hadn't been his or hers. Someone had passed close. He hadn't told her yet. He wasn't sure if she could bear it, but he knew the quiet wouldn't last. The trust between them was fragile, but it was there now, built not from confessions, but from the ordinary act of staying. Jonas felt the weight of it in his chest. He had meant to live alone, and yet here he was, keeping watch not only for himself, but for her. And as he listened to the wind scrape across the prairie outside, he knew the men who had hurt her might already be looking. The next morning, Jonas saddled his horse before the sun was fully up, his movements slow and deliberate so as not to wake Eliza. He told himself he needed to check the range, but the truth was simpler. He wanted to know if those tracks he'd seen by the creek were only strays or if men were circling closer. His gut told him the latter. The prairie air was cold, the grass damp with dew. Jonas rode low in the saddle, eyes scanning for fresh signs. He found them less than a mile from the cabin. 3 sets of hoof prints, cut sharp into the earth, heading east then looping back west as if testing the ground. He crouched over them, pressing his palm into the soil. They weren't more than a day old. Whoever they were, they had lingered. He didn't like it. When he returned, Eliza was sitting on the porch, quilt around her shoulders, staring at the horizon. Her face carried the calm of someone who had already guessed the truth. She looked at him hard when he tied off the reins. "They're out there," she said, voice thin but steady. Jonas met her eyes. He could have lied, but lies were wasted on someone who had survived what she had. Tracks by the creek. 3 men. Her hands clenched around the quilt, knuckles white. They'll come back for me. The certainty in her tone made Jonas's stomach tighten. Maybe, he said evenly, but not here, not easy. Inside the cabin, she paced while he checked the rifle. The sound of her bare feet on the wooden floor was restless, quick, like she was trying to outrun her own thoughts. Finally, she stopped, turned to him. You don't understand. They don't let go. If they know I'm alive, they'll hunt me until I'm back in their hands. Jonas slid a cartridge into the chamber and looked at her straight. Then they'll have to go through me first. Eliza shook her head, tears cutting down her face. Why? You don't even know me. You don't know what I've done, what they did to me. Jonas's jaw tightened. He had heard those words before from broken men in war camps. Men who thought what had been carved into them defined them forever. He stepped closer, voice steady. I don't need to know all of it. I know enough. You didn't choose what they did. That's theirs to carry, not yours. For a long moment, she stared at him, breathing ragged, as though weighing whether to believe it. Then she sank back into the chair by the fire, the fight draining out of her. She whispered, If they find us, you'll die because of me. Jonas sat opposite her, rifle across his knees. I've lived through worse than dying. What I won't do is walk away. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, filled with the truth of 2 people who had both carried things they didn't speak about. Eliza's hand slowly released the quilt, and she let it slip to her lap. For the first time since she had come to the cabin, her body eased just enough to show trust. That night, Jonas kept watch of the window. Eliza lay awake on the bed, eyes open to the dark, listening to the sounds of the prairie. The creak of wood, the snap of fire, the distant call of a coyote. Every sound made her tense, but every time she glanced toward Jonas, she saw him still there, steady as stone. The questions she had left unsaid since the first night. What kind of man was he? Why did he live alone? What had driven him out here? Lingered in the back of her mind. But she didn't ask. The answers weren't what mattered. What mattered was that when her world broke apart, he hadn't turned away. And as the fire dimmed low, the reality set in for both of them. The men who had carved scars in her body were not finished. They would return, and soon. The first light of dawn crept across the prairie, turning the sky a pale gray before the sun broke the horizon. Jonas was already awake, his rifle resting against the window frame, his eyes scanning the open land beyond the creek. He hadn't slept, not really. He could feel in his bones. This was the day. The tracks he had found weren't wanderers. They belonged to men who knew what they were after, and men like that didn't disappear. Behind him, Eliza stirred restlessly on the bed. She had slept in short bursts, waking at every sound. When she sat up, her hair was tangled, her face pale but alert. She saw the way Jonas stood at the window, the rifle never far from his grip. They're coming, she whispered, not as a question, but as fact. Jonas gave a short nod. Be ready. She rose, wrapping the quilt around her shoulders. Do you want me to hide? He turned from the window, his eyes steady on hers. No, you've hidden enough. His voice was calm but firm. He knew she deserved the truth. Running or hiding would not stop what was coming. What mattered now was whether she faced it standing. The sound of hooves reached them first, distant but deliberate. Eliza's hands trembled against the fabric of the quilt. She clenched them in a fist to stop the shaking. Jonas checked his rifle, loading rounds with practiced precision. Then he opened the door and stepped outside onto the dirt yard. 3 riders came into view, their horses dark against the rising sun. They moved with the confidence of men who had done this before, guns slung low, eyes scanning the cabin with casual arrogance. The leader raised a hand to halt the others, then called out, Hail, we ain't here for you. Send the girl out. Jonas stood still, his stance wide, rifle resting against his arm. His voice carried flat across the open space. You ride on. The men laughed, the kind of laugh that cut deep, meant to mock. The leader leaned forward in his saddle. That's ours you're keeping in there. You know what she is. You hand her over, and we'll leave you breathing. Inside the cabin, Eliza froze. She could hear every word. Her chest rose and fell in quick, uneven breaths. Part of her wanted to collapse back onto the bed, to disappear before they broke through the door. But another part, the part that had carried her across the prairie to Jonas's cabin, wouldn't let her move. She stepped closer to the doorway, watching from behind the frame, her fear plain but her body upright. Jonas's jaw tightened. "She's not yours. You come closer, you won't right away." The tension stretched thin. One of the men smirked, spitting into the dirt. Big words for a man alone. He reached for his revolver. Jonas fired first. The crack of the rifle split the morning, the recoil sharp against his shoulder. The rider pitched sideways off his horse before his gun cleared leather. The other two jolted, pulling their reins, horses bucking. One drew and fired wildly, the bullet snapping into the wood of the cabin door frame where Eliza stood. She flinched back, but didn't scream. Jonas chambered another round, calm, methodical. He fired again, the shot ripping through the second man's arm. The rider howled, clutching the wound, his horse bolting. The leader cursed, pulling his mount hard. He didn't fire. His eyes locked with Jonas's, and in that stare he saw something unmovable, something that would not yield. He spat once, then yanked his reins and turned. The wounded man followed, and together they rode hard back into the prairie, leaving their dead behind in the dirt. Jonas didn't lower the rifle until the riders were only specks against the horizon. Then he turned back toward the cabin. Eliza stood there, one hand gripping the doorframe so tight her knuckles whitened. Her chest heaved, her face wet with tears she hadn't noticed fall. "You stayed," she whispered, her voice breaking. Jonas walked up the steps, the rifle still in his hand. He didn't say much. Words had never been his strength. But he looked at her with a steady gaze. "Told you I would." For the first time since she had collapsed into the dirt that first day, Eliza felt something other than fear. It wasn't relief, not fully, but it was the star of safety. She stepped aside, letting him back into the cabin, the sound of his boots solid against the wooden floor. As Jonas cleaned the rifle and set it back against the wall, Eliza sat near the fire. Her body shook, but her eyes stayed on him. She had spent days believing he might send her away, that no one would risk their life for her again. Yet here he was, pale from the fight, but unshaken, his silence saying what words could not. The prairie outside was quiet once more, but both of them knew it wouldn't stay that way forever. The men who had fled might return, or others might come. Yet in that moment, the unspoken truth was clear. She was no longer alone, and neither was he. The morning after the gunfight, the prairie carried a strange quiet. Smoke from the rifle still clung faint in the air, and the body of the man Jonas had shot lay out in the dirt. Jonas buried him himself before the sun rose too high, digging a grave just beyond the tree line where the ground was softer. Eliza watched from the porch, the quilt pulled around her shoulders, her face pale, but her eyes unflinching. She didn't cry for the dead man. He had been part of the ones who ruined her, but she carried the heaviness of seeing death again, this time in her name. When Jonas came back, dirt on his hands, she finally asked what had lingered unspoken since the night she first collapsed in the prairie. "Why do you stay with me? You could have left me there. You could have sent me away." Her voice wavered, but her eyes locked on his, demanding truth. Jonas wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his arm, sat down on the step, and rested his forearms on his knees. He thought a long time before answering. "Because I know what it is to have no one stand for you. I had my share of that life. Done things I won't ever make right. But this, keeping you safe, it's the one thing I can do without regret." His voice was steady, stripped of softness, but it carried weight. Eliza swallowed, tears building. "I thought I'd never matter again, that I'd just be what they made me." She looked down at the scars beneath her dress, then back at him. "But you look at me like I'm not ruined." Jonas turned his head, meeting her gaze straight on. "You're not." The words were simple, firm, and left no space for doubt. Over the next weeks, life slowly shifted. Eliza's body healed, the wounds knitting beneath the bandages Jonas changed each day. Her hands grew steadier, her steps stronger. She began helping in small ways, gathering kindling, stirring meals, mending clothes. Jonas noticed how she carried herself differently now, not always curled inward with shame, but lifting her chin when she stepped outside. The riders never came back. Maybe the leader had seen enough in Jonas to know the risk wasn't worth it, or maybe they would surface again one day. But as the days turned into weeks, the fear that had once pressed on Eliza's chest began to loosen. She still woke at night sometimes, gasping from dreams, and Jonas would rise quietly, stoke the fire, and sit nearby until she slept again. He didn't touch her unless she reached for him, but his presence was constant, and that steadiness gave her something stronger than comfort. It gave her ground to stand on. One evening, as the sun dropped low and painted the prairie in shades of copper, Eliza stood beside Jonas at the fence line. They had been repairing posts, the quiet broken only by the hammer of nails. She leaned against the rail, catching her breath, and, after a long pause, she said, "I used to think family meant blood. Parents kin people tied by name. But blood didn't save me. A stranger did." She looked at him, her eyes clear now. Maybe family is who stays when you can't stand on your own. Jonas studied her face, the bruises mostly faded, the scars hidden, but no longer the only thing that defined her. He nodded once, his jaw tight. "Family is who stays," he said, repeating her words as though fixing them in place. That night, the cabin was warm, the fire steady. Eliza pulled the quilt across both their shoulders, leaning against him for the first time not from fear, but from choice. Jonas shifted slightly, allowing it, his arm settling gently around her. Neither spoke of what tomorrow might bring. They didn't have to. What mattered was that the silence between them no longer carried loneliness. By the time the prairie went dark and the stars filled the sky, the question of whether she was safe, whether he would stay, had already been answered. They had chosen each other, not with vows, not with promises, but with the simple act of surviving side by side and refusing to walk away. In the unforgiving Wild West, where so many lost everything, Jonas Hale and Eliza Carter had found something rare. Not redemption, not perfection, just the steady, unshakable truth of belonging. And for both of them, that was enough.